Welcome to the first lesson in our unit on sensation and perception. In this lesson, we'll focus on the difference between sensation and perception and introduce ourselves to some of the terms and concepts that we'll need for our discussion. So what is the difference between sensation and perception? Well, sensations are things like smell, sight, hearing, taste, touch, pain, and others. The raw data of experience. But they are not all that there is to perceiving the world. In fact, they by themselves are meaningless. However, once sorted, identified, and arranged by our mental process, this data becomes perception. So, sensation, the raw data of experience; perception, the sorting, identifying, and arrangement by mental process. Sensation occurs at a sensory organ. Perception occurs in the brain. Let's take a look at a different drawing. We can see that we have sensory input from all these places, and all this sensory input comes into the brain, gets sorted, farmed out to different parts of the cortex to be understood and identified. This bottom-up processing from the sensory systems into the brain can be seen kind of like this. For example, if we look at an image, we can see its color, its size, its shape, its texture, and then we're going to construct up from the sensory receptors to a higher level of processing. We call this bottom-up processing. But we also have top-down processing, interpretation that's influenced by experience, emotion, and even expectation. And those come together. And where these two meet in the middle, we have perception. So perception is a combination of bottom-up processing of the kind of the data of the experience, but it's kind of colored by our past experience, our emotional state, and even what we're expecting. And so that what perception is, it's not quite necessarily always reality. We'll talk a lot more about this top-down processing later in our unit when we get to the perceptual side of this, but for now, I want you to think about how these things, experience, emotion, and expectation, could affect how you interpret this data coming in. Stop the video and see if you can write down a couple of examples of kind of how your experience, emotion, and expectation would change your perception. Go ahead, stop the video, write down a few ideas. Now let's focus on sensation itself. When energy comes into the body, when we receive information from the outside world, it comes to us in the form of physical energy. And we have to convert that physical energy of stimulus, whether it's light in the back of our eye, or pressure on our skin, or waves of sound waves traveling through the air that hit our eardrum. We have to convert that physical energy into neural impulses, and we call that process transduction. So some form of energy stimulates a receptor cell, maybe in our eye or our ear. I have a picture here showing the back of this is the retina, the back of the eye, so that if light comes in and strikes the back of the eye, it could stimulate these neurons, these sensory neurons, to fire, and if the stimulus is strong enough, it'll send that information down sensory neurons up into the brain to the proper part of the cerebral cortex. So light comes in and strikes the eye, and we send our action potentials up to the brain down the optic nerve here, and the brain sees light or an image. But the question is, how does the brain know that those action potentials traveling down there were light? How does the brain distinguish between two different forms of stimuli? How does the brain know it's sensing light versus sound? Well, the answer lies in the pathway that the information takes on the way into the brain. Different stimulus comes in on different channels. For example, when sound waves hit the ear and stimulate the inner ear, neural impulses are sent down a very specific pathway to the auditory processing center in the temporal lobe. So if messages come in on this pathway, these action potentials are interpreted as sound. Well, what about a different system? If light comes into the eye and travels down this specific pathway for the optic nerve, and it gets sent to the back of the brain, the occipital lobe, for visual processing, those neural impulses are interpreted as an image, as light. So no matter what, if you stimulate the neurons in the back of the eye, you see light. So if you pressed on your eye and you stimulate these neurons, the pathway, since those neurons travel down this pathway, or those action potentials travel down this pathway, you would see light. Try it. Close your eyes and press on your eyes. It might hurt a little bit, but you'll see light. And if you get hit in the ear, your ears will ring. As you stimulate the neurons in the inner ear, we hear sound. So, theoretically, if we could rewire the brain and maybe take this message that's coming in on the auditory pathway and or let's go over here to the visual pathway, if we could take this message and reroute it into the temporal lobe to the auditory processing center, we would hear light. Or conversely, if we could reroute this information and take this wire and plug it in here, when sound waves came into the ear, but if we routed them into the occipital lobe, we would see sound. So it's the pathway that the information comes in on that determines what the brain senses. Well, how does the brain determine between different strengths or intensity of the stimuli? After all, what we learned in our last unit is that an action potential is an action potential. It's an all or nothing event. There's no such thing as a strong neural impulse or a fast one or a slow one or a weak one. They're all the same. So how do we determine the difference between, let's say, a slap and a tickle? Well, the answer lies in how many and the frequency of the receptors that are firing. This information is going to create a pattern that the brain interprets, the difference between red and orange, loud and soft, bright and dark, or a slap versus a tickle. So, what about the minimum amount of stimulus that we can detect? What's the lowest amount of sound or light you can see? In an ideal situation, the smallest amount of stimulus a person can detect, 50% of the time, is called the absolute threshold. The absolute threshold happens to be quite low under ideal conditions. For example, let's say we have a candle. What's the absolute threshold for our ability to see this candle? Well, it turns out it depends upon the conditions. If I, for example, turned out the lights, in this type of situation, we could see a very small amount of light a great distance away. But if we changed it and added other light source, another ambient light source, it might be very difficult to see that same stimulus. The same thing, hearing sounds on a busy street corner. It'd be very difficult to differentiate between different tones. So the absolute threshold depends upon the environmental conditions. But what about our psychological state? Let's take, for instance, a new parent with a newborn child. They're staying up late at night. They're tired. The baby doesn't sleep through the night. They could very easily sleep right through their alarm clock. They're exhausted. But you know what they won't sleep through? They won't sleep through that baby crying, even if the baby is much quieter in another room compared to the alarm clock right next to your head. Or what about if you return home after seeing a scary movie, or after you go to your tent after hearing ghost stories around the campfire? What then? What do you hear? I bet you hear every sound in your house, all those creaks that you usually wouldn't hear, or every branch as the wind stirs the trees above you. This is called the signal detection theory. The fact that our ability to detect stimulus is dependent on our psychological state. If we're afraid or fearful, we may hear things that we wouldn't hear at other times. Or imagine you were expecting a very special delivery. Maybe it's your college acceptance and you're home on a Saturday waiting for the mailman to come, and every car that comes by you rush to the door to see if it's the mailman, whereas other days you might not hear that stimulus. Our emotional state or our psychological state can prime us to lower our absolute threshold for a stimulus. So that's absolute threshold. What about things that are lower than our absolute threshold? What about things that are subliminal? Subliminal stimulus, by definition, is below our absolute threshold, therefore outside of our conscious awareness. We can't hear it. The question is, can it affect us? Well, it turns out, in 1957, a market researcher named James Vickery inserted the words hungry, eat popcorn, and drink Coca-Cola into a movie, one single frame of the movie, so fast that people couldn't even detect seeing it. And he was certain that that would increase sales at the concessions at the movie theater. And they reported that the concession sales increased, 18% for Coke sales and 57% for popcorn sales. And, this was thought to be a very big thing. When taken into the laboratory, though, we can see that some of these subliminal messages do have the ability to influence subjects, but when we look at them in the real world, we've got very little data to show that there's a real effect for subliminal stimulus. But with that said, we know that we process much outside of our conscious awareness, and that processing, that unconscious processing, does influence our decision making. So there's certainly a lot of people who are attempting this type of subliminal stimulus, and if you want to look into it, you can do a quick Google search of subliminal stimulus in marketing and find plenty of examples. We'll talk about it a little bit more in class. What we do well, though, is notice change. When stimulus goes from no stimulus to stimulus, or for example, low volume to high volume, we notice that change in stimulus. So we have a name for this. The smallest amount of stimulus change that we can detect 50% of the time is called our difference threshold, or the just noticeable difference. So here's a picture I took the other day of my son coming home after a long day of school and soccer practice. He's got his viola and a backpack on the front and a backpack on the back. And I wonder, do you think he'd notice if I added a book to his backpack that's already bulging at the seams? Let's investigate. So here's your backpack. And let's say when it's empty it weighs 2 kilograms. If I added 2 kilograms to your backpack, do you think I'd notice? I've doubled the weight. I'm sure you would notice. I've increased it by 100%. But what about your backpack? It's all filled up. In fact, it's bulging at the seams, 100 kilograms worth of weight in it. And I add 2 kilograms. I throw another book in there, another textbook. Do you think you'd notice the difference? A 2% increase? I suspect you wouldn't notice at all. So why is the same value of change noticed in one case but not the other? The difference threshold depends on the strength or the intensity of the original stimulus. A 100% increase compared to a 2% increase, the 100% increase is definitely going to be noticed, but the 2% increase may not. We call this difference threshold, or this idea, Weber's law, that the difference threshold is a constant fraction or proportion, and it's different yet specific for each sense. So that if you change the radio from, you have your volume on a 2 and change it to a 4, you're going to notice. But if you change it from 10 to 12, you may not, because it's just not as great a proportion of the original stimulus. What about a stimulus that isn't changing? When I moved to Atlanta, I lived near this busy road, and when I first moved in, I could hear the traffic. It kept me up at night. But after a while, I hardly noticed. This diminishing sensitivity to an unchanging stimulus is called sensory adaptation. Think about how when you walk into a room you might notice an odor, but after a while you don't. Or maybe the feeling of your shirt against your skin, after a while you stop noticing, or the hum of a fan in the room. We can look at it this way. If we have the same stimulus occurring repetitively over time, the response, our intensity of our response, will diminish over that same time. It's actually an adaptation, a survival adaptation. We don't need to pay attention to a stimulus that isn't changing. It allows us to filter out meaningless stimulus and focusing on those things that are changing. Basically, if it hasn't helped us or hurt us up to now, it's probably not important. If we couldn't stop responding to a stimulus that wasn't changing, we'd have a hard time having kind of energy left to focus on new things. So it's a good thing that we stop feeling our shirt against our skin, or the hum of the fan of your computer while you're doing your work, because it would distract you. So hopefully we can see in this first part that the world we perceive is not always as it really is, but how it is useful for us to perceive it. We'll look more into that as we move on. In the next lesson, we'll look at some specific sensory systems, specifically the eye and the ear, and we'll talk about a few more sensations, but primarily those two, as we tend to rely on them most. And then after that, we'll move into a couple lessons on perception. So if you have any questions, leave them for me below in the comment section, and I hope you learned something.